In 1982, at the age of just 22 years old, Jean-Michel Basquiat would create this painting. A powerful and striking image that mixes text and colour, symbolism and mark-making in a raw and uncensored explosion. In a single painting, he would use his instinctive powers of visual language to say everything he wanted to say about America, about art, and about being black in both worlds. Basquiat's meteoric rise in the early 80s sent shockwaves through the art world that can still be felt today. And in New York, on the art scene at the time, he stood out not only as a black man in a whitewashed world, but also as an artist that brought tension to its ethnic imbalance. He would become the first black painter to break through into international consciousness.
I know black people are never really portrayed realistically, and not even portrayed in modern art enough.
Basquiat would show the faces and name the names of countless millions of people that had been disregarded by art history. He would shake the art world with paintings that would depict the black experience, paintings that would be placed in museums that were meant for a whole different audience. 1982 was Basquiat's year. He was a rising star at the height of his powers, and this would be his most mythical and most sought after painting. A painting that after its initial sale was not seen in public for over 30 years. In fact, only a tiny photo of it survived as proof of its existence. Then, in 2017, it came up for auction. When Jean-Michel was in New York in 1978, it was a low-rent, high-crime, bankrupt city. Downtown Manhattan was a dirty mecca for artists, musicians, and filmmakers. People assumed that Basquiat was an uneducated, uncultured graffiti artist from the ghetto with a supernatural talent. This was partly a deliberate myth that he had constructed himself, and partly people's naive expectations of what a scruffy, dreadlocked black artist was. He was not this at all, and he was frustrated that the media was trying to portray him as that. He was an intensely ambitious, middle-class young man who was very knowledgeable about art history and had been taken to many museums by his mother growing up and encouraged to draw and paint. He was very aware of the absence of blackness in Western art. Basquiat was born to a Haitian father and a Puerto Rican mother in a solidly middle-class household in Brooklyn. He was privately educated. He was a gifted child who could read and write by the age of 4 and would speak 3 languages fluently. He was very close to his mother, who took him to see Guernica as a child at the Museum of Modern Art and enrolled him as a junior member at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. The young Basquiat was engrossed in drawing and painting growing up, but unfortunately his mother was committed to a psychiatric hospital when he was just 13, and he would leave home for good at 17. At first, he lived rough on the streets in Manhattan or on people's sofas. Then, in 1978, he would team up with an old school friend, Al Diaz, and they would form the street art duo SAMO. Basquiat and Diaz began spray painting on buildings in the Lower East Side. But while graffiti was about tagging and marking out territory, SAMO was a bit different from that. They were more poets and provocateurs, writing cryptic messages on walls next to art galleries. SAMO as Viagra for a flaccid society. SAMO as an end to it all. SAMO as an alternative to God, SAMO for the so-called avant-garde. But for Basquiat, it was just a means to an end. He was ambitious to become famous for his art, and SAMO was a way to get noticed by the press and the public. And when finally an article did come out about SAMO, he replied with "SAMO is dead" on street walls, and in 1980, at the height of their fame, he called it quits and went solo. He never considered SAMO to be graffiti to him. It was statements and poems. Yet even when he was hugely successful, Basquiat still got described as a graffiti artist, or an ex-graffiti artist, a term that he thought tied his work with the unsophisticated, and a term that he found simplistic and even racist. That year, he moved into the East Village with Alexis Adler. Because he had no money for canvases, he would paint on the floors, walls, doors and furniture. Then he would make postcards, which he sold for $1 on the streets. It was while selling postcards in Soho that Basquiat spotted Andy Warhol at a restaurant. He was a big fan of Warhol and was thrilled when he sold him a postcard entitled "Stupid Games, Bad Ideas." If you look, it features the noughts and crosses that he would also incorporate into Untitled. Warhol was intrigued by this paint-splattered artist from the streets, and a couple of years later would initiate a collaboration and hook onto Basquiat's rising stardom. There was a marketable glamour to being a down-and-out prodigy, something that we still see today in the art world. But Basquiat was never comfortable with it and got sick of the act. His reference points were the fine artists like Cy Twombly and Jean Dubuffet, and writers like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs, and musicians like Miles Davis. Basquiat would look at how early rappers at the time used samples, and he would apply that to his artwork in the same way that musicians borrowed from James Brown. He borrowed from Rauschenberg and Picasso and African art, and referenced his own Haitian and Puerto Rican heritage. He would paint several canvases at once and have dozens of reference books around him, and have music on full blast and the TV on at the same time too. His reference points were many and eclectic. Anatomy, poetry, history books, jazz, trashy TV, typography, and art history. They enabled him to create visual collages which were profoundly original at the time. And at the same time, his art was rooted in a rich linguistic history. He would fuse words and text together instinctively, like a musician. He was a master at using colour, and this is what would hold his works together. He would use oil stick with spray paint, crayons and acrylics, undiluted primary coloured oil paints layered in rapid succession. And he would build his figures up by reinforcing and overdrawing every line and form. He said, "I cross out words so you will see them more. The fact that they are obscured makes you want to read them." He would use his work to highlight black heroes, like the double A we see in Untitled, which may represent Aaron, a reference to Hank Aaron, the celebrated African-American baseball player, who was a childhood idol of Basquiat's and the first of his heroes to be crowned or sainted in his paintings. Crowns in Western art come loaded with historical baggage, and Basquiat would use the symbol of the crown to challenge notions of race and power. He would crown black heroes. For him, the three-pointed crown he used mostly represented athletes, musicians, and writers. The crown raises the disenfranchised to royal, even saintly status. Another symbol he used is the copyright sign. He used it as an ironic attack on the mechanisms of the art market and as a sign of reclaiming authorship. The coarse, spiked lines we see in his works read as barbed wire, a common sight in the New York of the early 80s. It has also been interpreted as metro lines. But it is the skull that we mostly associate with Basquiat. In 1968, at the age of 7, Basquiat was badly hit by a car while playing in the street and had to have his spleen removed. As he recovered in hospital, his mother brought him a book, Gray's Anatomy, which he memorized, and the anatomy would become central to his themes and artistic practice. The obsession is at its most unforgettable in his depiction of human skulls.
Let's just go through. What's this?
Pluto.
That's,
Based on a drawing that was the first drawing of the moon by Galileo.
and so this is actually an image of the moon there.
No, actually, it's an image. Actually, it's actually an image of the moon. No, it's based on a drawing of the moon, but it's an image of Pluto.
Yeah. This looks like an eye.
Yeah. That's the evil eye, the Malocchio.
Oh. And below there, what's this all the way to?
That's a Roman belt buckle. This says parasites.
Parasites.
Yeah.
And parasites meaning people?
No,
Or
meaning parasites.
meaning parasites. So when you're working on this Roman belt buckle, how'd you decide to?
Oh, that's from a drawing. I did at the Metropolitan of a Roman belt buckle that was bronze.
And so you just decided you wanted to put a Roman belt buckle there and went to your drawing?
No, I wanted to put a Roman belt buckle on this painting, right? I had the idea to do it, and then I went over to the Metropolitan Museum and I did the drawing of the buckle, and I came back with it and I put it right there.
Oh, well, that's kind of a slow process.
I'm a slow person.
One of the most important romantic relationships that Jean-Michel Basquiat would have was with Susan Malouk, and they were in an on-again, off-again relationship from 1981 to 1983. Susan Malouk was born in Canada, the daughter of a Palestinian-born mother and a British man, and she came to New York City on Valentine's Day in 1980. They first met when she was working in a bar in the East Village. He would come there every day to read poems to her and treat her to the best drinks on the menu. They moved in together fast. It was a volatile relationship. She would work, they would fight, and he would make lots of art. Once they went to the Museum of Modern Art, and he asked Susan to count how many black men she saw. There were none. Basquiat said, "This is another white man's cotton plantation." Susan wrote in her later biography that one morning Jean-Michel says that an art critic is going to come over and interview him. In walks René Ricard, who published the first major article on Basquiat, The Radiant Child, and then the art world zeroed in on Basquiat. Galleries, the critics, the journalists, Andy Warhol. Everyone was now obsessed with the then 21-year-old boy and his original paintings. Basquiat's paintings are hard to describe, as René Ricard wrote. I asked someone once why they liked Jean-Michel's work and why it was being singled out for acclaim, and he said, because it looks like art. And it really does. At first his paintings seem really perplexing, and you think you need to know what everything means to understand them, but all these apparent symbols represent his inner or outer dialogue, something he read or a conversation he heard that day, some melody he was reminded of, or some movie he saw. Some image, some discontent, some person that annoyed him. He wrote the word tar, for example, because he sometimes felt as black as tar. He heard a homeless man on TV say Jimmy Best on his back to the sucker punch of his childhood files, so he painted that. His paintings are like jazz, twitchy, chaotic, absorbing everything around him. Look at the interview he did with the Metropolitan curator Henry Geldzanger. For example, he asked, "What about the list of the pre-Socratic philosophers and the kinds of materials which get into your paintings always, that derive not so much from Twombly as from the same kind of synthetic thinking? Is that something you have done since your childhood? Lists of things?" Jean-Michel replied, "That was from going to Italy and copying names out of tour books."
Where did the words come from?
Real life books, television.
Yeah, and you just skim them and start including.
No, I mean, when I'm working, I hear them, and I just throw them down.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean things like Punic Wars. I remember that was in one of your.
Oh, that was from a guidebook on Roman history.
And you had been reading it and.
Well, it wasn't that long, that actual history part of it. It's like, history of Rome in 5 pages,
Yeah, and so you snatched a few words from it.
Yeah, I didn't
Yeah.
snatch them,
They caught your.
They caught my eye, and I took them.
He depicted the things that happened in his life. Susan happened a lot, so he painted her a lot. Here is a painting about the day that Susan found Jean-Michel kissing Madonna. Susan attacked her and won, as you can see from Madonna's crossed out name. Here is a painting called Big Shoes. It's about a day that Susan and Basquiat did a lot of coke, and he demanded that she wear only one pair of big men's shoes. And this one is called Arroz con Pollo, about the day he cooked his favorite dish and dined naked. What do you see in this painting? A man? A woman? A punching sound? And a fireman? Susan explains in her book the story behind it. He disappeared for days, and someone told me that they'd seen him at the Roxy with a blonde. Someone else told me he was living with 2 black girls in Soho. Someone else told me he'd gone to LA. I was furious. Then Jean came back. I told him to get out, and that I was going to call the fire department. I would never have told Jean that I was going to call the police. He would never have forgiven me for that. Never. So I said the fire department, and that made him laugh and laugh. So I punched him very hard. You see, these things are the things that happened in his life, and he painted his life. Basquiat's career would coincide with the neo-expressionist movement, a return to painting, and the re-emergence of the human figure. This raw and powerful painting would announce the arrival of the virtually unknown young artist as one of the movement's leading figures. After finishing Untitled in January 1982, New York gallerist Anina Nosei gave him a studio underneath her gallery so he could work on his first solo show with her. A rumor started that he was being kept in the basement churning out masterpieces.
That's just it has a nasty edge to it, I mean, I was never locked anywhere. I mean, oh Christ. No, it's just, if I was white, they would just say artist in residence rather than say all that other stuff.
It has been said that Basquiat's driving force was to be accepted after the rejection of his father. Fame gave him something like that and a lot of money. But he never felt totally accepted. He sold his first painting to Debbie Harry for $200, and within a year he was selling paintings from his first solo show for $20,000, and faster than he could paint them. His solo show with Anina Nosei sold out and was a huge success. He found himself traveling to Europe for more shows and living with Madonna and becoming best friends with Warhol. He may have been living a lavish lifestyle, but he still faced racism every day. He would leave successful opening parties and find it impossible to get a cab, as we can see depicted in this painting. In stores, he would get followed by security and would get refused entry into expensive restaurants. Such was the climate in America at the time. And once he was held for 2 hours at the airport security and questioned as to how a black man with dreadlocks could afford to fly in first class and have so much money. For Basquiat, making it didn't mean getting a show or making lots of money. He wanted proper recognition from the art establishment, but there was prejudice against him. For his youth, for his graffiti connection, for being untrained, and for his subject matter. Unable to deal with the demands that fame brought him, in 1988, at the age of just 27, Jean-Michel Basquiat, the most successful black artist in history, died from a heroin overdose. His meteoric rise and often controversial career really lasted for just only 8 years. Basquiat was an artist who was as dedicated to his craft and just as aware of his legacy as Michelangelo or Picasso. He was driven, ambitious, and worked extremely hard to get where he did. When Madonna lived with him, she said that she would wake up at 4 a.m. in the morning and would still find him painting. He had a natural need to create, and in his short career, he would produce over 2,000 works, and he would never compromise his art and never dilute the message. And the message is as relevant today as it was 40 years ago. Yet despite his importance, there are very few of his works in public collections. There is not one in the UK, and very few internationally. Untitled had been in the same private collection since it was bought in 1984 for $19,000. When it came up for auction in 2017, it reached the highest price ever paid for a work at that time, not just by a black artist, but by any American artist ever. It sold for $110 million. His art is inextricably linked to his life. His works live on as a testament to his brief and spectacular life. And he continues to influence the art world profoundly today.